a bit personally now. How do you feel with these upcoming elections?
Good question.
Just
On the one hand,
shortly, if you
I
can.
try to enjoy the kind of the distance. So in a certain sense, I'm really grateful that I don't have to be in Hungary right now because I believe that it's a kind of a collective psychosis, and I am pretty sure that it would be really tough to kind of distance myself from it.
Mm-hmm.
Or just to keep a kind of healthy distance from its day-to-day happenings if I would be back in Hungary. Yeah, at the same time, and probably another feeling is this kind of really profound lack of, not necessarily knowledge, but lack of foresight. So I don't really know
Uh-huh.
what will happen in the elections, and this is pretty new.
Három, dü, jeden.
Einmal.
Balkans Calling. Voices from the region.
Kristóf, thank you for accepting the invitation to our podcast, Balkans Calling. We are just a few days away from another deciding European election in the eastern part of the continent, the Hungarian parliamentary elections, which will happen on the 12th of April. Over the past decade of Orbán Viktor being in power, Hungary has become one of the most politically debated countries, both within Europe and the EU and internationally. But elections involve real people, not just abstract notions. This is why in this episode, we want to bring the topic closer to our listeners and explore other day-to-day perspectives in this talk with one of our former visiting fellows, Nagy Kristóf. He is a historical anthropologist and sociologist specializing in the cultural politics of contemporary far-right governments. Again, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. And I would like to ask you if you could introduce yourself very briefly. While I was reading through your research, I found it very interesting because I previously studied only history, and your research topic and everything is very intersectional. So I think it would be very interesting for our listeners as well to know a little bit more about you.
Thank you, Antonia, for the invitation and for the opportunity. Yeah, I was a visiting fellow at the University of Regensburg over the summer of 2025, so almost a year ago, or it feels like a year ago. And so I am happy to return, at least in this format, hopefully
Yeah.
once I will return also physically. So currently I am a Fung Global Fellow at Princeton University, and I am working on transforming my dissertation into a book, this kind of typical postdoctoral project. And as you mentioned, I have this kind of complicated background hopefully in a good sense, or sometimes it's an obstacle, but sometimes it's a kind of a good resource. So I have an MA in art history and also a PhD in social sciences, specifically in sociology and social anthropology. And I am really interested in blending these kind of two approaches together. And to add a few more layers, I am coming from a Marxist tradition. I am a proud member of the Helyzet Working Group for Public Sociology, which is based in Budapest, which is a scholarly and activist, scholarly or socially engaged scholarly collective with the general aim to understand on the one hand, the post-socialist transformation, and also more broadly the contemporary social transformations in Eastern Europe in the history of capitalism, and also by paying special attention on let's say the spatial location of the region, that capitalism doesn't have the same formation in Central Eastern Europe as it had in the UK or in the US. So it's a kind of a research collective which is really profoundly inspired by word system analysis. And for years I also edited the Fordulat Journal of Social Theory in Hungary, which is a Hungarian journal that aims to publish cutting-edge Marxist scholarship, but it also has the ambition of translating it for a broader audience. So not only to the half dozen professional Marxist scholars of the country, but also to speak speak for broad audience, for activists and beyond. And so I have this kind of Marxist background, and I try to bring it to the analysis of culture, cultural politics, and cultural policy, which is not necessarily the easiest task, but at the same time, I believe, or for me, it's an intellectually exciting task. On the one hand, and I think it means maybe two main things. The first is that I try to pay attention simultaneously on the material and financial aspects of culture, but also on the ideological and aesthetic aspects of culture and art. And I think these aspects are too often separated from each other. So there are the culture studies people who are mostly focusing on the ideology of culture, or if they are critical on the critique of ideology in culture and so on. And on the other hand, there are, let's say, political economists who are, in general, they are not so interested in arts and culture because it's just a minor section of society. But if they are interested, they rarely touch the, let's say, the ideological aspects or belief systems and so on. So I, in my own work and I scholarship, I try to combine this kind of two aspects and not to separate, rather to put together, because I really believe that the material conditions and dependency of artists and cultural producers and cultural institutions are definitely not independent from their ideologies. They are rather the two sides of the same coin. Yes. And maybe a last sentence, because it's a surprisingly long introduction or self-introduction. So I am also interested in understanding that how cultural policy is part of a longer history of capitalism, which is not necessarily a self-evident question, because culture and cultural policy is usually studied in the scale of nation states.
No problem with the length. I think it's understandable for everybody when you have such complex, kind of separate but not really subjects. It is hard to compress everything into, let's say, one sentence. But I also find it very interesting, and art and culture are inherently political. I find it really hard to separate these elements. But now to kind of stir the conversation towards the topic, because we will talk about a more political topic, but from a different perspective, as we mentioned before, I want to ask you a bit personally now, how do you feel with these upcoming elections?
Good question.
Just
On the one hand,
shortly, if you
I
can.
try to enjoy the kind of the distance. So in a certain sense, I'm really grateful that I don't have to be in Hungary right now, because I believe that it's a kind of a collective psychosis, and I am pretty sure that it would be really tough to kind of distance myself from it, or just to keep a kind of healthy distance from its day-to-day happenings if I would be back in Hungary. Yeah, at the same time, and probably another feeling is this kind of really profound lack of, not necessarily knowledge, but lack of foresight. So I don't really know what will happen in the elections. And this is pretty new, I think. So in the last couple of Hungarian elections, really since, I think, 2010, 2 weeks before the elections, because now we are really 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks before the election days, it was kind of clear that who will win the election. And the answer was always Viktor Orbán will win the elections. And now there is this kind of situation when the leading political force of the opposition, Péter Magyar and his Tisza party, are leading the polls. At the same time, the Fidesz has far broader resources and infrastructures. Practically, they can mobilize the entire state, and they also mobilize the entire state. So in this sense, I think it's a kind of a really tough question for anyone that will be the elections. And this is a completely new, let's say, epistemic situation that we don't know what will happen.
Completely agree. And because you mentioned that you feel in Hungary right now, there's this almost mass psychosis going on because you dealt so much with cultural production in Hungary. Do you think that with the electoral campaign that has been going on, that is going on right now, do you think that cultural production has been more heavily instrumentalized politically? For example, manifestations or some artistic performances heavily not influenced, but rather economically helped by Fidesz to portray this one image of Hungary that they want.
It's a really great question, and when you sent me this question before the podcast recording, I started really thinking, and I have the feeling that actually in this current campaign, art, or at least this kind of elite culture, is far less politicized than before. So
Okay.
when Viktor Orban came into power first, it was 1998. Anytime when he gave a big speech in the tribunes behind them, it was full with high-profile intellectuals, with architects and writers and poets and so on. And for now, this kind of completely disappeared. And now practically only pop singers and influencers are sitting behind him. And in this sense, I feel that at least in the electoral campaign, there is a less direct pressure on high culture or elite culture, on the producers of high culture and elite culture, because it seems to be a kind of a sphere that doesn't really matter in the electoral campaign. And at the same time, there is a really strong deployment of influencers and other shapers of public opinion. So I think actually there is a shift from elite culture to popular culture, and this paradoxically, I feel that this brings a certain kind of autonomy for elite culture, or at least there is less direct pressure on, I don't know, museum curators to create an exhibition before the elections that would directly back the campaign and so on. And yeah, so it's a surprising phenomena also for me. And at the same time, there is one more aspect that the opposition, so Péter Magyar's Tisza Party, also deploys culture pretty consciously. So in mid-March, a new documentary movie was launched on him. I haven't seen it, but it kind of portrays him in this kind of really positive way. It was launched in cinemas, and it had more than 80,000 people view it in the last 2 weeks. So it was practically the most viewed film in Hungarian cinemas in the last couple of weeks. And so this is also kind of a new twist that, oppositional forces using, let's say, culture or popular culture in this kind of conscious way, which wasn't really typical for previous positions of Orban.
That is very interesting. I didn't know about this documentary. This is the first time I've heard about it. But then do you think I've seen a lot on Instagram mainly. I get a lot of ads, for example, from the Tisza part. Not really a lot from Orban, honestly, and from Fidesz. But do you think that then Tisza is using more high culture, like this documentary, compared to the more influencer based that the Fidesz is going towards to kind of try to reach the masses better?
It's a great question. Actually, there are a few high culture people around the Tisza party who are kind of high profile, a broadly acknowledged actor, Ervin Nagy, who is a kind of a leading actor of the country and also an opera singer and so on. But I am not sure whether it's a kind of conscious deployment or is there a conscious policy in Tisza party that they prefer elite culture over popular culture, or I would rather think that they could kind of embrace these people, or these people were kind of happy and ready to march beyond them. Yes, so I think it is not a pure rupture, and I believe that they would also be happy to embrace, I don't know, singers or other people who are adored by the entire society and not only by social elite.
Okay, yeah, I see. And while we're on the topic of influencers, let's say, and because I mentioned Instagram previously, because I personally encountered a lot of these fake AI videos that were made by Fidesz that are very heavily anti-Ukrainian, anti-war, and they're really trying to push a certain narrative of, oh, Fidesz will save the country because if you vote with Tisza, then we're on the side of Brussels, which will send our sons to war. Do you think they have any influence on the so far undecided voters, if there are any voters of the sort?
Yeah, that's a great question, and of course it would be mistaken to argue from my personal experiences because I wasn't really targeted with these ads, and I think it is not accidental. I think these kind of ads are targeting rather let's say the lower sections of the society, or rather working class people, and I think they have this kind of conscious objective to somehow find an external enemy for the local social tensions, because definitely there are local social tensions in Hungary. So the Hungarian economy is practically stagnating since the COVID crisis. Practically, there is no economic growth, and also there is a fact that the EU more or less cut the funds towards Hungary. And to be honest, the Hungarian economy since 2004, it has been really strongly an EU funds and EU subsidies led economy. So in this sense, there is a growing social tension in society and in the Hungarian society. And I'm pretty sure that Péter Magyar could also, so Péter Magyar's rise was also really strongly produced by this kind of social tensions that were accelerating because of this economic crisis. I think this kind of anti-Ukrainian campaign has this central goal to externalize the enemy, to kind of shift the discourse from local social tensions to some external enemy, and it also tries to practically point out that the Ukrainian state has a fault in the local economic slowdown because the EU is subsidizing the war in Ukraine and not its own countries and so on. So in this sense, it tries to offer an explanation for this kind of local social and economic crisis. And I believe that it achieves certain success, or if you have a look on how public opinion shaped on Ukraine within Hungary, it shaped pretty dramatically. So in this sense, this kind of really often AI-generated advertisements achieve a kind of success. It's the question, and maybe the main question, is it enough to win the elections or not? And I think we will need a few weeks to figure it out. But the objective is clear that nowadays, in the last weeks of the campaign, Orbán and the other leaders of the Fidesz, they are talking practically exclusively about Ukraine. So there is nothing else in their agenda.
Yeah, exactly. And I really think it reverberates with the people because, again, returning to Instagram, I also get a lot of videos that are not specifically from either of the parties, but they're just from independent or some journalistic endeavors where you have people that go and ask other people on the street who would they vote for. And the first question that people usually reply back is, oh, which party are you from? Why do you want to know my opinion? And then they jump straight into Ukraine and how they will vote for a specific party. Usually they will vote for Fidesz, so their sons don't get sent away. Yeah, it's mainly about the fact that they want to protect their families, and they see that Fidesz is the only one that would guarantee that in the context of the war.
And just to recall, this is really a recipe that once worked. So practically in 2022, so 4 years ago, the Fidesz won the elections with this kind of campaign. So the elections were really just a few months after the war on Ukraine started, and the prime minister or the opposition leader of the opposition of 2002 had a kind of a sentence in a television interview that he would consider sending Hungarian soldiers to Ukraine if there would be a broad NATO mission. And from that point, the Fidesz really consciously and deliberately used this single sentence to argue that the opposition would send our sons and daughters and our babies to Donbass and Kharkiv. So in this sense, it's a recipe that worked once. It's really a good question whether it will work again.
Yeah, it is difficult to predict, to make some parallels with the situation in Romania, for example, because last year with the cancelled Romanian presidential elections, there was also a lot of agitation almost happening against Ukraine, but also in general, we had the far-right parties that were heavily supporting Trump and anti-EU and everything. And a lot of people just got most of their information from TikTok and other social medias, and this message really shaped their views to the point where we had to cancel the elections. It is really hard to predict. I never thought that would happen. It did happen. We're just gonna have to see.
Yeah, and we can see this kind of elections are happening more and more, or there is a more and more class-based fault line, definitely in Hungary. And I think it's not a uniquely Hungarian case that practically upper classes are voting for the opposition and lower classes are voting for Fidesz. So in this sense, it's really paradoxical because the Fidesz didn't have really pro-worker policies. Rather, it had really conscious pro-capital policies.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it was pretty successful in crafting this coalition between its own capital interest, or the capital interest it embraces, and the local working classes. And actually, the social strata that turned against Fidesz, I think it was this local middle class that before, or
Mhm.
4 or 8 years ago, it was rather divided. There
Mhm.
were, of course, oppositional voices, but many people really profited from the economic policies of Fidesz, which really preferred upper middle classes. And now, in the current crisis, I believe that there is this kind of general resentment in middle classes that, okay, these policies are not really serving us. I think that's the reason why actually many middle class people are turning against Fidesz, who previously did not have so serious objections towards it.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you bring out. And while we're talking on the topic of Fidesz with Magyar Péter, because he also comes from within the ranks of Fidesz, he kind of broke away from it in more recent years. But in your opinion, as a sociologist, let's say, do you think he would be a genuine break from the regime, from what is currently happening in Hungary? Or will he follow a similar line politically, maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, there are two separate questions. The first question,
Yes.
that what do he want to do, and the other question is what can he do if in case he wins the elections, because it is really, or probably according to the current polls, the most probable outcome of the election will be that the TISA party will win, but they won't have a constitutional majority. They will have a kind of a narrow majority in the Hungarian parliament, while the Fidesz in the last decade or 1.5 decades kind of really strongly placed people in key positions who could be removed only with a 2/3 majority or with a constitutional majority. So in this sense, if the most probable election outcome will happen, a narrow TISA and Magyar win, it's a really great question that what can he do, or where are the limits of his power. So I can really imagine that there is at least a chance that it will produce a kind of an interregnum when there is this kind of new power ruling formally or having the majority in the Hungarian parliament, but at the same time the real power is still in the hands of the people appointed by Orban. So I think we should really think about this chance, because you cannot really change these people or these positions without a constitutional majority. The other question that you had is on his ambitions. That's a great question. I think we don't know so much about his ambitions. I mean, he's a political figure, so I think we shouldn't kind of and he tries. I think he's a really clever politician, but it also means that he does not necessarily tell so much on the exact steps that he wanna do. And I think that his real ambitions for these reasons are pretty unclear, or I think he tries to become this figure, this kind of empty signifier to which everyone could project their dreams. This kind of Fidesz voters could project the dream that he will continue this politics just in a more fashionable way. Yeah, I don't know, liberal voters could really project their hopes that he will restore the rule of law and all these kind of liberal dreams. And so in this sense, it's a really great question that what are his real objectives. But I think he will definitely, even if he wins the elections, he will really have to face with a lot of limitations. So yeah, because it won't be that kind of win that Orban usually had. That
because you talked about the figure of Magyar Péter and what he's trying, what his ambitions are. I watched a few interviews with him, more specifically the first interview. You can find it on YouTube, where he was talking about his motivations to go into politics separate from Fidesz. And he chooses his words very carefully, while also, in my opinion, trying to find a way to say something that sounds like the truth. We don't know if it's actually the truth, but he's trying to sound slightly different compared to other politicians. At least that's how I got the vibe of him.
Yes, I think he definitely, there is one breaking point that he nowadays, or at least in the last couple of months, he really consciously frames himself as this kind of pro-West politician. I think it was not so directly emphasized when he started his political career 2 years ago, but today he is practically giving this kind of pro-West and anti-Putin speeches. This is a kind of a new development, and I think, this was not happening before.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's definitely also a kind of breaking point with Fidesz, where practically the critique of this kind of liberal world order is really a central organizing power of their politics.
Yeah, definitely. Because you mentioned previously the fact that it would be hard for the TISA party to kind of change the people that were already put in power, for example. What would that mean for state-backed cultural institutions or other cultural organizations, in your opinion? Would any win for the TISA party mean any changes in that area, or how do you see the situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I was preparing for this interview, I was printing out the program of the TISA, and especially the pages where they are talking or writing about culture. And it is kind of empty, or they have this kind of two general propositions. On the one hand, they will restore the freedom of culture, which is kind of a buzzword, because how can you imagine a culture which is free from everything? I mean, there are always social constraints that are shaping culture, and it's rather the question is that what are those forces that are shaping? I mean, culture never exists in a vacuum. And on the other hand, it was really surprising me. They really put a lot of emphasis on this kind of marketization or market-led development of cultural production. There are actually two sections on film productions, and especially on runaway film productions. So in Hungary, in the last 2 decades, actually many Hollywood productions were shooting in Hungary because the Hungarian state offered really great tax conditions. So it made super cheap, affordable to shoot Hollywood movies or any kind of blockbusters in Hungary. And of course, they were also consciously producing the labor force for it. And actually, the TISA party in their program, they dedicated 2 separate sections on how to continue and expand this program. So in this sense, I think it signals really well that there is this kind of strong interest and engagement to stay embedded into this global value chains of cultural production, of course, in this kind of subordinated position. So in this sense, I felt this kind of 2 main tracks in their cultural programs. On the one hand, to restitute the freedom of culture, which is really buzzword, and I think Orbán also argues that they were the ones who offered the freedom for culture, which was previously curtailed by liberal forces or by woke and by things like that. And the other hand, this kind of to embrace and further enhance market-led processes. And actually, there is a sentence that they will kind of screen the Fidesz-led cultural institutions, but they don't. It was really exciting. They don't specify that which are these institutions. So in this sense, I think it's consciously an unclear and unspecific text. That, for example, I was studying in my dissertation and in my book, I'm writing about the Hungarian Academy of Arts, which is an institution which was established by Orbán's government in 2011. It is even mentioned in the Hungarian constitution, and it really became a kind of flagship institution of the Orbán's regime, and also a kind of one of the most hated cultural institution of liberal opponents. But this institution is not appearing in the TISA program, neither positively nor negatively. I would also think that probably changing or shaping cultural institutions wouldn't be really a priority if they get into power. So I can really imagine that they would have so many other things to do. So it's a great question that what would happen in the field of cultural production. I have this kind of plan that in the case the TISA wins, I would like to do some follow-up research on my previous project. Previously, I was really studying how Fidesz is building up its own cultural state apparatus. I was, of course, studying how it builds institutions, but I was also interested that who are the artists or more broadly intellectuals who are ready and happy to join to this political project. And I would be really curious to see and follow up that what happens with these institutions if the TISA wins. So probably if the TISA wins on the 12th of April, I already have my summer plans.
That's great. The research
yes.
is basically writing itself for you then.
Yes. I think this is probably also a question for artists and intellectuals around Fidesz, where I think that they probably have this general feeling that they are not so acknowledged, especially because Fidesz in the last decade really placed a special emphasis on kind of embracing popular culture. And of course, this kind of producers of elite culture, they are in general hating popular culture, and they have this feeling that it really endangers their privileged positions. So in this sense, I can really imagine that there is a kind of distancing or alienation among, let's say, conservative or right-wing intellectuals and Orban's political project nowadays, because actually this is a regime which is not, I mean, it definitely created institutions for conservative and right-wing elite culture, but somehow these institutions are more marginal than they wish to be.
Okay.
These institutions and their people really want to be the kind of the vanguard of the regime, but in practice they are rather existing at the margins of the regime.
Thank you so much for your answer. That's a very interesting perspective. And we shall see on the 12th of April if you can conduct your research or not on this
Yes.
topic. I think this is a good place to stop our conversation and to look towards the future in the next few weeks, in the next few days, what will happen. Kristóf, thank you again very much. It was a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot, I would say personally. I hope you also enjoyed our exchange. And thank you so much again for being on our podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, and it was a pleasure and a really thoughtful and exciting conversation also for me.
Check out our podcast recommendation in the episode description